God is not needed to pass judgment. Our fellow men suffice, aided by ourselves. Imagine that in a single moment, everything you currently take meaning and purpose in became hollow and vapid to you. That tomorrow you woke up to find your work unfulfilling, your family strangely unnerving, and your romantic partner repulsive. Worst of all, you realize you've been fooling yourself your entire life about almost everything. You discover that you are a crueler and more vicious person than you ever thought possible. You spiral into despair, grasping at anything that might give you temporary relief from this awful state. You finally arrive at the bottom of a deep well, clawing at the smooth walls in the vain hope of ascension, willing to give up anything if only you would be saved from this sorry state. This is, roughly speaking, what an existential crisis feels like. The foundations of our existence are taken out from under us and our entire life starts to spin out of control. A lot has been written on the nature and causes of existential crises, but perhaps no one has put this feeling into words quite as well as Albert Camus in his final published novel, The Fall. The Fall follows a man named Jean-Baptiste Clamence, a lawyer who has moved from Paris to Amsterdam and who spends most of his time in a seedy bar at the very centre of the city's infamous red light district. Through the novel, Clamence gradually relates to us his fall from the societal graces of Paris, and how he became disillusioned with humanity itself. Get ready to learn how we are all deeply hypocritical, how this novel poses questions you cannot possibly unsee, and so much more. As always, bear in mind that this is just my interpretation of this work, and also that The Fall is notorious for different people taking very different things from it. So I encourage you to read it for yourself for the full effect. But let's start with what Clamence's life was like before his titular fall, and how it sowed the seeds for his eventual collapse. 1. A supposedly idyllic life. The first few chapters of the novel see Clamence telling us about his life in Paris when he was still naive and innocent, before the crisis that would turn him inside out. He worked as a lawyer defending people from prosecution, and from his tales this was a truly marvellous life. He felt an ease in his movements, an unshakable self-confidence, and a gentle kindness flowed from him wherever he went. In one of his stories, he narrates how he defended someone's husband in the law courts without charging them any money, and how the defendant's wife showered him with praise for this, with him eventually kissing her hand to shorten her ever-growing thanks for giving her husband a second chance. In response to all of these compliments, Clamence turned on his heels and walked away, all to preserve the praise's proper resonance. Indeed, this general magnanimity seemed to permeate his life. He describes how he would help blind men cross the street, be courteous to the point of fame, and how he worked hard to allow those around him to feel totally relaxed in his presence. To anyone watching, it would seem like he was a genuinely kind and benevolent person. He even professes to have taken great joy in all of these actions. Far from begrudgingly aiding his fellow Parisian, Clamence practically fell over himself for the chance to help other people. However, all is not quite what it seems. Even at this point, we see a fatal aspect of Clamence's character lurking just beneath the surface, one that will eventually come to torture him. Looking back on it all, Clamence confesses that he did all of this not so much out of a desire to see other people benefit, but purely for his own reputational gain. In other words, even when he was committing all of these kind actions, the only thing on his mind was personal gain, be that emotional or social. And this was not merely in the trivial way that everyone could be described as selfish, doing good deeds and avoiding bad ones in order to escape the wrath of our own conscience, but rather because Clamence saw himself as playing a certain role, one that would grant him innumerable advantages, both in his own identity and through the perspectives of other people. Clamence came to this conclusion because he noticed there were certain behaviours he undertook when performing these benevolent actions that were purely for show. The key example he uses to illustrate this is that he used to doff his cap to blind people after helping them across the street. He couldn't have been doing this for the person he was helping because that person was totally blind. Instead, he admits this was all for the performance. He was taking a self-congratulatory bow after having played his character to perfection, and hammering at home to anyone around him that he has just done a good deed. and the applause he received for all this had its own purpose. At one point, Clémence notes that in Paris he was comforted by the knowledge that he was in some way superior to all the people around him, and that this belief rested not just on his own private opinion, but also on all of this praise he received from his peers. He had an enviable sort of innocent confidence. It did not even cross his mind that he might not be a man of the most excellent character, because he was constantly being told this by everyone he met, and as of yet, he had no significant evidence to the contrary. At this point, his sense of meaning is safe and secure behind the bulwark of societal acceptance, and he was so self-assured that he had no qualms whatsoever in taking whatever he wanted from life. He describes how in his life in Paris, he was something of a womanizer, and he says he felt a perverse sense of ownership over the women he courted. In his naive arrogance, he would not be satisfied until they had declared that they would love no other but him. And at this very moment, he would lose interest since they'd now done the work of supporting his identity. He was not forming bonds with these people, he was merely using them as existential props. His romantic success was yet another piece of evidence that he was uniquely brilliant among men. It is almost like every aspect of Clémence's existence had conspired to bolster his confidence. He felt like he was on top of the world, making his later fall all the more painful. In other words, Clémence could take a great joy in his life because his identity and purpose was perfectly stable and intact. He had an unshakable conviction that he was a good man, an intelligent man, and a successful man. He describes feeling like a ruler or a conqueror or some great hero of enormous significance. And moreover, it never even entered his head to question this rather generous judgment of himself. Clémence in Paris is a man totally without self-consciousness, and as a result, he is in total existential bliss. He has no sense of guilt or shame or emptiness since he has not reflected on potential faults of his character, or the ways in which his meaning for life might be insufficient. He has not yet learnt to fear the judgments of other people because what would there be to judge? He dances along in life, in his own words, totally at ease and yet satisfied with nothing. He was totally relaxed, yet could crave more of anything, more life, more sex, more money, and each time he felt totally entitled to this. Though it seems strange, we could compare Clémence to a kind of child here. He is essentially in a state that precedes self-awareness. He is not conscious of his own faults and is totally satisfied with this situation. Despite using women purely for his own pleasure and harboring, by his own admission, only selfish desires, he can still conjure up an idea of himself as a good and grand person. As is suggested by the title of the novel, Camus is drawing on some very Christian themes here. In Paris, Clémence is like Adam and Eve before they ate the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge and learnt about good and evil. He never has the sheen of self-conscious judgment interfering with his life. He is, as he puts it, in Eden, cher monsieur, no intermediary between life and me. But though he does not know it yet, Clémence is in a highly precarious position because his whole sense of meaning rests on an illusion. His innocent view of himself and of mankind as a whole is simply false, and soon events come together to bring him crashing down from his tower of self-aggrandizement to play in the mud. This transition from a comfortable lie to a deeply uncomfortable truth is a theme peppered through Camus' philosophy. According to him, you cannot run from the truth, because eventually it will catch you. And when it does, we had better be prepared. Clémence was certainly not, and he faces an unenviable situation as a result. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel, my email list, or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. Innocence Lost. What do you think are the sort of things that can give someone an existential crisis? Various scenarios immediately come to mind. It might be the death of a loved one, or infidelity in a long-term relationship, or realizing that our long-held dreams will never come to fruition. In each case, we have a general theme. A belief that we took great meaning and solace in is shown either to be false or not to be nearly as significant as we thought. While we may have intellectually known that our family was mortal, it did not properly sink in until one of them passed away. We may have lived many years in the assurance of our partner's undying faithfulness, but then it all collapsed in a mere moment. As a youth, we may have fallen in love with the idea of fame and fortune, but then we hit a certain age and we realize that it probably isn't happening. Many people fall into an existential crisis if they lose their faith in God. In each case, the convictions that form the bedrock of our motivations for living have been utterly destroyed. And unsurprisingly, we fall into a mixture of confusion and despair. In the case of Clemence, his meaning stems from this picture he has of himself as fundamentally good and great. But events begin to align to undermine this idyllic self-image. First, he gets into an altercation with a young motorcyclist on the streets of Paris, and in a scuffle with the crowd, he gets hit in the face for his troubles. Clemence is dumbstruck, and this has left him looking like a fool in front of the assembled traffic. This creates the first dent in the armor of Clemence's self-satisfaction. He had previously thought of himself as brave and physically powerful. As he puts it, he wished to dominate all things. And a large part of him genuinely believed that he could. For whatever he did, either he excelled at it, or he thought that he probably would excel at it if only he had the spare time to practice it more. However, in one stroke, his assailant has forced him to confront a minor example of his own impotence. A lot of people would probably get irritated at the indignity of this experience, but ultimately get over it pretty quickly. But remember, for Clemence, self-image is everything. He has not yet learned to recognize even one of his faults. He is totally in love with himself, believing himself a near-perfect being. So he becomes like a spiteful child who has had one of their wishes thwarted. He ruminates for days about what he would do to that bastard if he ever got his hands on him. He escapes into resentful revenge fantasies and chastises himself for having been treated in such a way. This is also the moment where Clemence learns to be judgmental. Previously, he had been totally secure and so felt no need to condemn others. After all, he only experienced praise and adulation. But now he becomes acutely aware of the human instinct to judge and chastise. As he puts it, "When I was threatened, I became not only a judge in turn, but even more, an irascible master who wanted, despite all laws, to strike down the offender and get him on his knees." This theme of judgment becomes very important later, because Clemence will grow to fear the harsh looks of other people much more acutely the further his own self-image degrades. The event that seals Clemence's fate, however, attacks not just his competence but his virtue as a person. When he is walking through the streets one night, he spies a woman standing at the edge of a bridge. He has a strange feeling, but ignores it and carries on walking. But then he hears a splash and screams behind him, and realizes the woman has jumped to her death into the River Seine. Much to Clemence's surprise, all of his heroism and love for humanity has vanished in an instant. Rather than rushing in to help the poor woman, risking his own skin in the process, he stands there passive and silent. He does nothing. He says he wanted to run and yet didn't stir. After he has witnessed this horrific event, he rushes home and tells no one of the encounter, not even reading the papers the next day for fear of learning about the woman. Though he ultimately denies it, it is clear Clemence feels deeply ashamed of his inaction. Even if he does not know it yet, his identity has become irreparably shattered. According to Clemence, his life continues much as normal for the next 3 years or so. But then one day, when he was feeling particularly triumphant, he lights up a celebratory cigarette and hears a laugh behind him. Not necessarily a threatening laugh, he even describes it as friendly, but one that nonetheless seems to mock him. He turns around to see who it is, but there is no one there. Nonetheless, this has a profound effect on him, and it is the very moment his whole worldview falls apart. It is when he begins to face the absurd. In Camus' philosophy, the absurd is the gap that opens up when we attempt to find meaning in the universe and inevitably fail to do so. Since without a god, it is very difficult for the universe to provide meaning for us. This is when we become acutely aware that our lives are, objectively speaking, pointless and futile. And when we are forced to decide how to react to this harrowing information. For Clemence, the laugh in the darkness infects him and begins to nurse a scornful and mocking attitude towards life and the people around him. It, in effect, gifts him a kind of forbidden knowledge. It tells him that human life is not a dignified, serious affair at all, but is instead comedic, worth laughing at. And, perhaps more worryingly, Clemence decides that those who do not yet know this are fundamentally beneath him. Whereas before, he felt a sort of selfishly tinged brotherly love for his fellow man, now he was filled with a spiteful contempt. Put a pin in this, as we will revisit this concept in the next section. And Clemence's new nihilistic attitude does not just affect his outlook going forward either. It reaches back into the past to reveal the hidden motivations of all of his previous actions. Whereas before he had no self-consciousness and so viewed his supposed goodwill towards others as genuine and selfless, now he can see it for what it was, a tool of his own self-aggrandizing that he maintained to puff himself up. In hindsight, he considers all of this kindness as not a sincere reflection of his innermost feelings, but rather a kind of role he was playing. He is a mere actor who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. The sincerity is robbed out of every one of his decisions and behaviors, painting his entire life as essentially meaningless busywork, mere distractions on the route to the grave. But beyond this, he is convinced of the emptiness of everyone else's little roles as well. The hypocrisy of mankind becomes unbearable to him. He sees people judging others while being full of sin themselves, and is essentially two-faced. This leads him to theorize about mankind's double nature, where we fool ourselves into thinking we are better than we are because that is the only possible way we could stay sane and be able to live with ourselves. Worst of all, he realizes that we humans have such an aptitude for self-deception that we fool ourselves into thinking that we're being sincere. He compares everyone, including himself, to the person who wants the waitress at the restaurant to smile at us. So we are relieved of the guilt of having temporarily turned her into our servant. Most of all, Clemence becomes aware of all of his own faults, and he realizes there is much that other people could judge him for as well. This all leads him to some truly erratic yet fascinating behaviors, which is just what we shall look at next. 3. Rebellion and cynicism. In Milton's famous poem Paradise Lost, the character of Satan reacts to his imprisonment in hell by giving himself over to complete and utter rebellion against God. Rather than face up to his own crimes, he rejects divine judgment and vows to work against God for all eternity. In many ways, Clemence has a similar reaction to his own situation. As soon as he becomes aware of his own imperfections, he becomes terrified that other people will begin to judge him for them. He can feel everyone's eyes on him, examining his faults, and he knows they will eventually find them. Moreover, the stakes are higher for him than they would be for any of us, since he has no independent sense of meaning to fall back on. All he is what other people say about him. At first, he tries to escape the judgment by any means necessary. So he drinks himself into a stupor and has endless attempted flings with the women he comes across. The intention here is to dull his mind to such an extent that he loses his newfound self-consciousness. He is drinking both to forget and to recover his sense of confidence. I'm sure many of us can relate. And this does work for a short while. He even says the laugh of the absurd has become so faint that he barely noticed it. But soon he encounters pretty dire health problems and has to stop drinking. And since he was not interested in a genuine interpersonal connection with any of his lovers, when he's sober, he can't stand the sight of them. So he gives up on the romantic approach as well. Now he has a clear head, he concocts a different idea. He will start to reveal the absurdities of the world to those around him, spreading his self-consciousness to everyone and dragging them down to his level. As I said in the last section, he views the judgments of other people as the height of hypocrisy. After all, we are all sometimes dishonest, sometimes cruel, sometimes cowardly. We all have things that we could be judged for and found lacking. So why do we think that we are fit to judge other people? On Clemence's analysis, it is effectively a defense mechanism. To borrow his metaphor, we spit on others so they cannot spit on us first. We point the finger as an attempt to divert the situation that we really fear, that others will, quite rightly, single us out for criticism and censure. And it becomes Clemence's mission to make people notice this uncomfortable fact, to recognize the absurdity inherent in their own existences. At first, he attempts to do this by playing the part of a modern-day Diogenes. He argued in public that the so-called innocent man is just as guilty as the criminal they are testifying against. He would invoke God in the company of atheists simply to upset their worldview. He would demonstrate how all of us have done evil actions or left potentially good actions undone. He consistently works to expose the hypocrisy underlining our interactions. And rather than encouraging us to come to terms with these unbearable truths, he instead wields them like a weapon. According to Clemence, most of us are fooling ourselves in some way about who we truly are. We think we are generous, but we're actually self-interested. We think we are cool, collected, and independent, but deep down, we yearn for the approval of others. We consider ourselves a competent expert in our field, but in fact, we are just making do with the information we have as we go along. And everyone else is too. What seems like a grand rational structure of people coming together to form stable societies is actually a bunch of emotionally driven apes desperately trying to keep up their illusions, because we are not strong enough to face the sheer absurdity of it all. Of course, in some ways, Clemence is doing something really quite cruel here. He has discovered a fact about the world that makes him fundamentally unhappy, and in response to this, he is spreading it around so others can share in his misery. Remember, he is not an absurdist. He has not come to terms with the meaninglessness of existence. He is in the middle of it, fighting against it. At the same time, he has become unable to stand the hypocrisy of the world around him, and to a certain extent, who can blame him? One of my favourite things about Camus' writing is that he crafts brilliant characters like this. Ones where you feel strangely sympathetic because there is a certain sense underlying their philosophy, and you can understand exactly where they're coming from, while at the same time being repulsed by their indifferent or cruel attitude to those around them. Camus' stories are a bit like car crashes in slow motion. You cannot help but be fascinated, while at the same time slowly filling up with anxiety. And through Clemence, Camus poses a profound question to us as readers. Say we were in Clemence's position. What should we do? If we uncovered a terrible truth about the world and had our innocence ripped away from us in one fell swoop, should we keep this to ourselves? If we found out that the world was run through with hypocrisy right down to its deepest level, but that the illusion of sincerity was all that kept people from falling into despair, are we duty-bound to guard this truth, preventing anyone from learning it? How should we react if we become convinced that almost all human interaction is steeped in dishonesty, and that most people hold a warped perception of themselves as far greater and nobler than they actually are? Yet at the same time, this is the only thing stopping them from falling to pieces in front of our eyes. As perhaps one of the only philosophers who argued there was no solution to the problem of nihilism other than just moving past it altogether, Camus must have felt the burden of forbidden knowledge resting on his shoulders as well. Either way, Clemence has made his choice. Having attempted to run from the absurd, he now preaches a twisted form of its gospel. And like any good prophet, he comes with his own solutions to these deep problems in living. And this is just what we shall next examine. 4. The Judge-Penitent. So, to sum up, Clemence has two profound issues. He is deathly frightened of the judgments of others, and he is also unable to cope with life's newfound meaninglessness. Where can he go from here? Well, having had a go at being the modern cynic, laying out everyone's flaws through ruthless critique, he now devises a subtler way to reclaim a place of power over his peers, and to also find meaning in absurdity. First, he gives his solution for everyone else, and then he reveals his own unique approach. For those of us who have not yet viscerally faced the absurdity of existence, Clemence encourages us to limit our self-consciousness as much as possible. And he says the only surefire way to do this is to serve something, anything, to pledge ourselves to a cause or purpose and follow it to hell if need be. Here we must set hard limits on the questions we ask. We must run from existential critique as if it were the plague. This is very similar to the concept of philosophical suicide that Camus talks about in The Myth of Sisyphus. To put it bluntly, we retreat into intellectual cowardice. We become like a child, hiding their face behind their hands when something scary comes on the television. So deep is Clemence's existential suffering that he conceives of free thought itself as something fundamentally destructive to us. And he says that doctrinal slavery is infinitely preferable to his sorry state. But of course, Clemence himself cannot use this approach since he has already asked these existential questions. He cannot unsee what he has seen, so he takes on the role of the Judge-Penitent in order to avoid the judgment of others and recapture his sense of superiority and human dignity. The Judge-Penitent is someone who will point out their own flaws for everyone to see. They are no longer interested in trying to rescue their characters at all, but instead bask in their own self-flagellation. This instantly insulates them from criticism others might throw at them by essentially preempting whatever it is they might say. In itself, this is not the end of the world. It can be quite freeing to recognize our own faults. And it does release the pressure of having to craft an idealized, insincere persona to carry around with us when we're out in public. But then, Clemence's strategy takes a sinister tone. Clemence realizes that from this position of extreme self-punishment, he can start to judge other people again, this time without hypocrisy. He can lower himself to the position of the villain and subtly imply that we are, in some ways, very much like him. And perhaps, to a certain extent, he is right. One of the reasons I find Clemence such a fascinating character is because he contains so many of our own faults but pushed to an absurd degree, if you'll pardon the pun. And this means we might see dim reflections of Clemence in ourselves. Where do we nurse an idealized image that does not correspond to who we are? Where do we fool ourselves into thinking that we are superior? Where do we do everything in our power to judge and condemn others, positioning ourselves above them? And where do we rest our own approach to life on a lie? Clemence himself has never quite got over this yearning for his old innocence to be returned to him. At the end of the novel, he shows us a stolen painting he has come to possess. It depicts judges going to meet Jesus Christ, the innocent one, the Lamb of God. He tells us he has locked this symbol of innocence away to show us that there are truly no innocent parties. There are no innocent people. There is no God, there is no method by which our sins become forgiven or worthwhile. But despite all of this, Clemence truly longs to be forgiven, to be told that it is all okay, that he has been absolved of all of his faults, and can proceed onwards in innocence and repentance. But in a meaningless world, there is no one around to do that. There is no divine force to wipe away his sins, no saviour coming to redeem him. And us humans are such unworthy judges that our own forgiveness means nothing at all. He only has his actions, his unalterable history, and his profound deficiencies in character, and he cannot stand it. Perhaps many of us feel the same. I know that I do some of the time. Clemence may think that he has conquered the absurd, but he is still suffering its effects. On some people's interpretations of the novel, Clemence is a dark version of Camus' absurd man, the person who has made peace with the meaninglessness of life and has learnt to move beyond it. But I have to gently disagree. I think Clemence is someone who is still deep in the quagmire of an existential crisis, and is a wonderful illustration of just how miserable, cynical, and outright villainous it can make us. And it all stems from the arguably quite sensible realization that there is no meaning out in the universe. Clemence wishes to make us aware of this fact and drag us down to his level. But do we have the strength that he lacked to face the absurd head on? To embrace the radical freedom of a godless world and all of the horrible consequences that come along with it? Can we lock eyes with the void without flinching? Can we learn to do what Clemence did not? Laugh with the absurd, rather than have it cackle mockingly in our face? I don't know the answer to this question. It is one of the starkest and darkest inquiries in existential philosophy. But I think Camus' great and personal novel does a wonderful job at bringing it into focus, and illustrating just how bad things can get if we continue to mourn our past innocence. We may not be able to unsee the absurd, but perhaps we can learn to greet it with a smile, rather than with hatred. Reading The Fall is a little bit like looking at a basilisk. The damage is done by the time you turn the final page. The questions cannot be unasked. The insights cannot be unlearnt. All there is left to do is deal with the consequences. But perhaps you want a more general grounding in Camus' philosophy. Well, if so, check out this video to watch my analysis of the myth of Sisyphus. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.